Hello, everybody. Welcome. We're going to give it a moment or two to make sure that we've got everybody jumping in on the webinar. Welcome, everyone. We're just going to give it one more minute or 30 more seconds to let everyone join us. I can tell people are still joining. I can see the number, so I'm going to, I know I said 30 seconds, but I'm going to give it another 30 seconds. Hello, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Evanston History Center's August Under the Buffalo Lecture. I'm Eden Duran-Perlman, Executive Director of the Evanston History Center, and I'm coming to you live from the beautiful Dawes House in Evanston, Illinois. As many of you know, this National Historic Landmark building is the headquarters of the Evanston History Center. We're happy to report that we are currently open for tours and research, but we still can't host in-person events safely. So we continue to host our event series virtually. We'd love to be able to host these lectures. We love to host these lectures that reach all of you, both near and far. Once again, tonight, we have people joining us from coast to coast, so welcome everyone. This season's Under the Buffalo presentations focus on the broad topic, politics, power, and representation. Our next event will take place Thursday, September 30th at 7 p.m. Central, different start time, and we will welcome historian Allison Finkelstein to discuss her recently released book, Forgotten Veterans, Invisible Memorials, How American Women Commemorated the Great War, 1917 to 1945. In her fascinating book, Dr. Finkelstein examines the groundbreaking role American women played in commemorating those who served and sacrificed in World War I. We're very much looking forward to her presentation. Then in October, we will welcome Dr. Kara Finnegan to discuss her new book, Photographic Presidents, Making History from Daguerreotypes to Digital. Dr. Finnegan will explore the evolution of presidential photographs and the ways these images represent and reflect themes in the nation's history. We hope you'll join us for these events as well. More information and registration are available on our website, evanstonhistorycenter.org. We'll also post links tonight to the History Center's membership page and donation pages. We thank all of our members for their support and encourage you, if you are able, to become an annual member. Not only will you support terrific programs like this one, but you can attend other programs for free. Before introducing our speaker, I'd like to extend a special welcome to Dr. Betty Coed, historian at the U.S. Senate Historical Office. Please, it's a pleasure to have you with us tonight, Dr. Coed. I would also like to thank our co-sponsors for this event, Alliance Bernstein. I'd like to introduce Andy Jacobs from Alliance Bernstein to say a few words.
Thanks, Eden. Hey, we're delighted to partner with the Evanston History Center on this timely and compelling event. As a global leader managing money for families, foundations, and endowments for more than 50 years, Bernstein has a keen appreciation for history. And during this current historic time, it is especially useful to understand the past to inform the future. Tonight's program is a perfect example of why this matters and why the Evanston History Center is a vital resource to our community.
Thank you so much, Andy. It is a pleasure to work with you and your team. And now, tonight, we are in for a fascinating presentation. We're thrilled to welcome our speaker tonight, Dr. Daniel Holt, Assistant Historian at the U.S. Senate Historical Office. Dan is coming to us live this evening from his office in the Hart Senate Office Building on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. As you all know, the Evanston History Center is housed in the former home of Charles Gates Dawes. Dawes served as vice president under Calvin Coolidge, and in that role, he served as president of the U.S. Senate. We have long wanted to host an event with the historians of the U.S. Senate, and when we connected a few months ago, Dan suggested the topic for tonight's talk. Not only will we be treated to a tailor-made presentation by one of the country's leading experts on the history of the U.S. Senate, but we're also treated to a presentation that is critically relevant to both understanding American history and our current political scene today. And by the way, tomorrow, August 27th, is Charles Dawes' birthday. He was born 156 years ago tomorrow. At the Senate, Dan writes on Senate history for print publications and the web, conducts tours of the U.S. Capitol, and provides historical information to senators, staff, journalists, research, and the general public. He earned a PhD in history from the University of Virginia. Prior to joining the Senate Historical Office, he was a historian at the Federal Judicial Center from 2009 to 2016. During the presentation, if you have questions, please use the Q&A feature and type your questions there. After the presentation, we'll be fielding your questions and hope to have a nice, lively discussion. Again, thank you all for joining us, and thank you so much, Dan, for being with us tonight. And now I will hand it over to our speaker, Daniel Holt. Thanks so much.
Thank you for that introduction. I really appreciate it. Thank you to Jenny Thompson and Eden Duran-Perlman and everyone at the Evanston History Center for inviting me to be a part of this program. It's really a pleasure to do so. And thank you to everyone in the audience who had a choice of things to do on this evening and decided to spend it with us. It's really appreciated. I'm going to just share my screen here, and anybody can warn me if that doesn't work. Hopefully everyone can hear me and see me, and if not, somebody could shoot me a flare or something. So,
Dan, you're all good to go.
Great. So on March 4th, 1925, Charles G. Dawes took the oath of office as Vice President of the United States, President of the Senate, and delivered the most memorable vice presidential inaugural address since Andrew Johnson in 1865. Johnson had made headlines that year by showing up to the Senate clearly drunk and delivering a rambling, incoherent speech. Dawes, on the other hand, was stone cold sober and delivered an address that had a laser-like focus. Dawes, whose primary role as vice president was going to be sitting in the presiding officer's chair in the Senate chamber day in and day out, told the assembly of senators, Supreme Court justices, and soon-to-be President Calvin Coolidge that the Senate was an affront to American democracy, an obstacle to effective government, and that he was going to use all of his energy to change the rules that allowed a minority of its members to keep legislation from passing and obstructing the will of the people. The response of the senators on hand that day ranged from bemusement to outright anger. Who is this guy to tell them how to run their institution, they said. What did he know about it anyway? Well, in today's talk, I'll start by giving a brief introduction to Charles Dawes' career and his path to the vice presidency. I'll then give some context to what the office of the vice president looked like when Dawes took the oath in 1925. And finally, I'll discuss the filibuster in Senate history and Dawes' crusade to abolish it. Charles Dawes was born in 1865 in Marietta, Ohio. He graduated from Marietta College in 1884 and received a law degree from Cincinnati Law School in 1886. He started his career with a law practice in Lincoln, Nebraska, where he worked out of the same building as William Jennings Bryan. He became a director for a small Lincoln bank, and from there continued work in finance and banking. In the 1890s, he became president of a Chicago utility company and moved his family there. In Chicago, he became acquainted with Marcus Hanna, industrialist and Politico, who managed William McKinley's successful 1896 presidential campaign. Hanna gave Dawes charge of McKinley's campaign in Illinois, and after McKinley's victory was awarded with appointment as the controller of the currency. Dawes became quite close with McKinley in that role, often lunching with the president and his wife at the White House. In 1901, at age 36, Dawes ran for the Senate, but lost. He retreated from politics into banking for the next decade or so until America's entry into World War I. Herbert Hoover, appointed to manage food supplies during the war, offered a job to Dawes, but Dawes wanted to be in uniform. So at age 52, he received commission as a major in the Army Railway Engineer Corps. He was soon promoted to lieutenant colonel and was appointed by General John J. Pershing as chief procurement officer for the U.S. forces in Europe. When he left the Army, he had attained the rank of brigadier general. Now, after the fighting ceased, Dawes' public profile grew. In February 1921, Dawes testified before a House committee investigating war expenditures. Though a Republican himself, he resented the attempt of the Republican congressman to tar the Democratic administration with charges of extravagant spending during the war effort. In reply to a question about high expenditures on horses, Dawes exclaimed, "Helen Maria, we weren't trying to keep a set of books over there. We were trying to win a war. I'd have paid horse prices for sheep if the sheep could have pulled artillery to the front." His exasperated, colorful performance brought him national attention, and he acquired the nickname Helen Maria Dawes. And this is just one of the many editorial cartoons that were published around that time, showing him using his force against the befuddled committee. President Warren G. Harding appointed Dawes to be the nation's first director of the newly created Bureau of the Budget. In 1923, Dawes was appointed to head up a commission to try and solve Germany's post-war financial problems. The resulting plan that bore his name, the Dawes Plan, earned him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1925. With this impressive record of accomplishment, Republican officials had Dawes on the short list to join President Calvin Coolidge's 1924 re-election campaign as the vice presidential nominee. He was nominated at the party convention that summer and accepted. With Calvin Coolidge living up to his nickname of Silent Cal, Dawes solidified his reputation as a straight talker and took the lead on the stump, attacking Democratic candidate John Dawes and Progressive Party candidate Robert La Follette. Coolidge and Dawes were elected with a commanding 54% of the national vote. On hearing of his nomination, Dawes later wrote, quote, "Some people may claim that the vice presidency does not amount to much, but just then it seemed to me the greatest office in the world." So why did people in the 1920s think that the vice presidency didn't, quote, amount to much? Well, the vice presidency is a rather strange office. The framers of the Constitution created the position in the late stages of the 1787 convention in Philadelphia and named the vice president as president of the Senate. At least one of the founders was quite open about the fact that this was done partly so that the holder of the office would have something to do. Despite the vice president's modern role as a close confidant of the president, for most of the Senate's history, the vice president's primary job was to preside over debate in the Senate chamber day in and day out. Vice presidents fulfilled this role with varying degrees of engagement over the decades. The nation's first vice president, John Adams, took the job very seriously, sometimes inserting himself into Senate debates. Senators of the time didn't always appreciate that. For a time in the 19th century, the vice president was granted the power to name Senate committees, but senators took that power back after a few years when John Calhoun of South Carolina used the power for partisan ends. Vice presidents ruled on questions of rules and procedure in the chamber, but the Senate soon established that a majority of senators could overrule the vice president's rulings. In the early 20th century, vice presidents continued to preside, but increasingly relied on the input of Senate clerks to guide them on questions of rules and procedure. So the vice president had, by the early 20th century, been somewhat marginalized within the Senate. However, the office was just beginning to gain a foothold in the executive branch in the 1920s. Warren Harding invited his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, to sit in on cabinet meetings so as to remain informed about the administration's policies. This line of communication was likely helpful to Coolidge when he took office upon Harding's death in August 1923. Dawes, however, surprised everyone when he declined to sit with Coolidge's cabinet even before Coolidge had asked him to. Dawes said he did not want Coolidge to feel pressure to invite him. He saw the vice presidency as different from appointed cabinet members, since at this point in time, presidential candidates did not hand select their running mates. Despite espousing support and affection for President Coolidge, Dawes's move reportedly rankled the president. It would not be the last time. Charles Dawes was a successful businessman, a talented administrator, one who spoke his mind, someone who got things done in every position he held in his career. He preemptively cut himself out of a large role in the Coolidge administration, and now he was slated to sit in the Senate day in and day out and listen to senators speak. This might not have been destined to go very well. Which brings us back to the stir that Dawes caused with his inaugural speech in the Senate chamber on March 4th, 1925. In that era, the vice president traditionally took the oath of office in the Senate chamber, with the president-elect, Supreme Court justices, invited foreign dignitaries, members of the House of Representatives, and all the senators in attendance. It was tradition for the newly sworn vice president to make an address to the crowd before they all moved to the east front of the Capitol to swear in the president. Following his swearing in, Dawes rose to deliver his address. What he said shocked the assembled audience. Dawes stood at the presiding officer's desk and told the gathered crowd that as the representative of the people, not beholden to the senators or any faction of them, it was his duty to comment on how the Senate's way of doing business affected the nation. He told them the Senate's rules were, quote, subversive of the fundamental principles of free representative government. Dawes's target was the Senate filibuster, the rules that allowed for small groups of senators, or sometimes just a single senator, to delay or block votes on legislation. The filibuster, he said, serves to, quote, lessen the effectiveness, prestige, and dignity of the United States Senate. Who, he asked, would dare maintain that the right of the Senate to act should ever be subordinated to the right of one senator to make a speech? As much as what he said, it was how he said it that took people aback. Dawes pointed his finger at the audience, he pounded his desk, and sometimes shouted to emphasize the seriousness of his plea to reform the rules. Senators wasted no time registering their disapproval. Democratic leader Joseph Robinson of Arkansas called the speech ridiculous. Thaddeus Caraway of Arkansas contended that Dawes, quote, disclosed he was almost as lacking in knowledge of the rules of the Senate as he was in good taste. Claude Swanson of Virginia called the whole thing a farce. Others refused to comment, implying that their words would not be fit to print in the newspaper anyhow. As if his fiery speech were not enough, Dawes followed it by flouting other traditions in the Senate that day. In that era, the terms of recently elected senators began on the same day as the president and vice president, and the vice president would swear in the newly elected senators, escorted to the presiding officer's desk in groups of 4 to take the oath. Dawes, apparently tired of the proceeding, instead told the clerk to call everyone at once and just swore them in masse. Dawes then signaled that it was time to move to the east front of the Capitol for Coolidge's swearing in, forgetting that senators traditionally had time to sign a book to record their taking of the oath. After Coolidge's swearing in, Dawes then failed to return to the chamber to officially adjourn, leaving senators waiting around for him and not really knowing what to do. All told, it was not an auspicious beginning to his vice presidential term. Why had Dawes taken the opportunity of his inaugural address to call for reform of the Senate? And why did the senators react with such disdain? Let's dive a little deeper into the history of the filibuster and where it stood in 1925. The most famous filibuster, by the way, is probably a fictional one from 1935, the 1939 film, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. So I figured I would show the obligatory image of Jimmy Stewart on the floor of the recreated Senate for that film. The filibuster developed in the Senate because of a combination of rules it had and rules that it did not have. In the Senate, a member wishing to speak on a measure must be recognized by the presiding officer and can hold the floor as long as he or she wishes, speaking about anything they want, not just the measure at hand. There was no rule on the books whereby a senator could bring debate to a close and force a vote on a measure. If a senator wanted to speak, they had the right to speak for as long as they could. We know from the diary of Senator William McClay of Pennsylvania that in the very first Congress in 1789, senators were quite aware that they could tie up the chamber and delay action. Despite these elements in the Senate's rules, obstruction was not a common practice in the Senate for most of the 19th century. The first notable filibusters took place in the late 1830s and early 1840s when the two-party system of Democrats and Whigs emerged. By the 1860s, obstruction took place enough that the tactic earned a name, the filibuster. The word derived from the Dutch word for pirate and had up to that point referred to raids by private citizens to take control of Central American and Caribbean island nations, often with the goal of expanding slavery. Now, some important changes in the Senate led filibusters to become more common in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. One of the most important factors was likely workload. As Congress took up important questions related to industrialization, finance, immigration, and civil rights, the demand on the Senate's finite time grew larger. This was especially true in the second sessions of a given Congress. Prior to 1933, Congress convened in December of odd-numbered years and stayed in session usually until the early summer. Congress returned in December for a short session, sometimes called the lame duck session, which concluded on the following March 4th, the day that the new terms for members of Congress and the president commenced. The time crunch, especially in those short sessions, meant that with an adjournment date fast approaching, a minority of senators could tie up the chamber to run out the clock and prevent action on a measure, either because they objected to that particular measure, or in other cases, were holding it hostage to get some other measure that they favored passed first. Without a procedural method for stopping debate and forcing a vote, the Senate could be crippled by a determined minority. And while some bills could not pass, others by the tens, sometimes approaching the hundreds, would be passed by unanimous consent without any debate on the floor at all, as each session of Congress came to a close. And this, as much as some legislation being held up, was especially troublesome to Dawes, who wanted there to be a decent amount of discussion of all legislation passed and not just frivolously passed. The filibuster and this, quote, right to unlimited debate, as the senators termed it, had an uneasy place in the Senate even during this time. Senators were often quick to deny that they were filibustering or engaging in obstruction. However, members were also passionate any time another member would propose to change the Senate rules to allow debate to be cut off. Beginning in the 1890s, the filibuster came to be identified chiefly with Southern Democrats who used the tactic to prevent Congress from passing legislation to protect the rights of African Americans, including anti-lynching, voting rights, and civil rights bills. With that said, it was not just Southern Democrats who used the tactic or defended it. In the early 20th century, it was often progressive Republicans who took the advantage of the Senate rules to block legislation. Senators like Robert La Follette of Wisconsin, George Norris of Nebraska, Hiram Johnson of California, William Borah of Idaho were all Republican in name, but represented an insurgent minority within their own party. In 1908, La Follette set a then record of speaking for 18 hours straight in an attempt to block a currency bill sponsored by a fellow Republican, Nelson Aldrich. In 1917, with US entrance into World War I becoming increasingly likely, a handful of anti-war Republicans successfully blocked a bill that would have armed American merchant ships. President Woodrow Wilson, who sought preparedness even as the US stayed out of the fighting, charged that, quote, the Senate of the United States is the only legislative body which cannot act when its majority is ready for action. A little group of willful men representing no opinion but their own have rendered the great government of the United States helpless and contemptible. Wilson drummed up enough public outrage that the Senate, including Southern Democrats, had little choice but to adopt some sort of method to limit debate and force a vote. And that procedure came to be called cloture. The new rule set a very high threshold for invoking cloture. 16 senators had to file the motion, and 2/3 of senators voting had to approve. The rule left a lot of time for further debate after cloture was invoked, but that debate would eventually end and a vote on the measure would take place. The new cloture rule may have been on the books, but implementing it was another matter. Senators were extremely loath to move for cloture, and the procedure was barely used. Between 1917 and 1924, only 5 motions for cloture were filed, and only once was it successfully invoked. Southern Democrats were very wary of voting for cloture in any context, lest their political opponents use it against them when they tried to block civil rights bills. Some senators chastised their colleagues for even considering filing a motion or stifling debate. Now, obstruction and filibustering was as much of an issue as it ever was in the 68th Congress, which began in 1923 and ended the day that Dawes was sworn in as vice president in March 1925. In February 1923, Democrats, led by Pat Harrison of Mississippi, launched a talkathon to defeat a Harding administration ship subsidy bill and continued to block action on it for the next 2 years. Bills on the Republican Party's agenda, including a bill to purchase a canal in Cape Cod, sale of the Muscle Shoals power plant, a Federal Reserve banking bill, and a farm relief bill all died at the end of the short session. The Senate also failed to act on 2 key executive nominations, one of which was Attorney General, leading President Coolidge to call the Senate into special session on March 4th, 1925. This was what had Dawes so worked up on the day that he was sworn in. Now, perhaps learning from Woodrow Wilson in 1917, Dawes was not content to let the issue lay with his inaugural speech. He decided to take his fight against the filibuster to the people. Dawes later wrote, in fact, that his inaugural address was calculated for this very purpose. Only by a speech that, quote, jarred the atmosphere of the occasion, he said, would the issue get attention outside of that chamber. In spring and summer 1925, with the Senate adjourned until December, he toured the country making speeches urging reform. He wrote pieces in popular magazines like the Saturday Evening Post. Dawes saw himself as a representative of the American people in the chamber, not placed there by a state nor by the senators. He told crowds around the country that senators engaged in obstruction for, quote, personal, sectional, and selfish interest, unquote, and declared himself to be non-sectional and nonpartisan. To achieve change, he, quote, would go right over senators' heads to the American people. He was not shy about putting pressure on senators, pleading crowds to demand action of their senators, even as they sat right next to him. In April, at an event of 1,000 people in Boston to celebrate the battles of Lexington and Concord, he told the crowd to let Senator William Butler of Massachusetts, sitting right with him on stage, how they felt about Senate obstruction. This apparently worked at the moment, as Dawes asked for everyone who was against the filibuster to stand up, and William Butler very slowly rose to his feet so as to not be heckled by the crowd, so probably. Dawes spoke in New Jersey to a crowd with the state senator Walter Edge in attendance. Just before going to Washington for the opening of Congress in December, he delivered a speech in Chicago at the Republican Women's Clubs of Illinois. In the presence of Senators William B. McKinley and Charles Dawes, he threatened that if Dawes, up for election in 2 years, did not sign on to support his proposed reforms, quote, he will not go back to the Senate from this state. Dawes was aware that his biggest challenge would be to persuade Southern Democrats to accept reform. In attempting to woo them, he tried to draw a distinction between ordinary legislation and what he called special cases. Southerners celebrated the filibuster for killing federal voting rights bills, which they often termed force bills. In October 1925, in an address to a crowd of 5,000 in Atlanta, he appealed to Southerners not to support filibustering out of fear for a new force bill. He proposed having 2 rules: majority cloture for, quote, unquote, ordinary legislation, and a higher threshold for special cases, which he defined as, quote, legislation involving alleged encroachments upon the constitutional rights of the states under consideration. Disappointingly to him, this did not win him any converts. Political cartoons of the time depicted Dawes as attacking the dignity of the Senate or wielding a, so here's, you can see he's shouting at the center, and the hat representing senatorial dignity has fallen to the floor. Other times they saw his aggressive stance as just as likely to harm the Senate as it was to help it, such as in this cartoon. As you can see, the senator is held to the chair by things that said Senate rules, red tape, and clearly he's afraid that this sword, this tool that Dawes is going to use, is going to be maybe more harmful than good. Mississippi Democrat Pat Harrison came to the defense of the Senate and the filibuster in speeches throughout 1925. And when the Senate reconvened in December, he was there to mock the vice president for his crusade right to his face. Harrison was a genteel Southerner with a gift for oratory who loved nothing better than goading the Republican majority. He chastised, quote, this Helen Maria person as a Don Quixote tilting at windmills, fighting to change an institution of which he was largely ignorant. Harrison warned Dawes not to interpret the cheering crowds at his events for support of his reform. The vice president was liable to get attention no matter where he went or what he did, Pat Harrison said. He was merely a curiosity. The people understood, Harrison said, that their rights are, quote, safeguarded by a guarantee of full consideration and a free discussion of all questions here. For his part, Dawes apparently laughed throughout much of the speech and told reporters he found it, quote, in good humor and good taste. It was not just Southerners who resisted filibuster reform, however. The American Federation of Labor criticized Dawes and defended the filibuster in 1925 because they opposed turning control over the Muscle Shoals power plant to quote unquote private exploiters and celebrated the filibuster that had stopped it. George Norris of Nebraska penned a rebuttal in which he rejected Dawes's proposal as greater evil than the filibuster. Norris, while conceding that individuals could abuse the power, asserted that a stronger cloture rule would limit senators' abilities to offer amendments and shape legislation. In short, he argued, the Senate would become just like the House, in which a small group of leaders controlled the legislative process and ordinary members would have little power. Norris's preferred solution was to do away with the short, lame duck session. For Norris, the real problem was the rush to hastily pass legislation as sessions came to a close. Bills that had little scrutiny and were supported by outgoing lame duck lawmakers. And that practice, he argued, and filibuster reform would be unnecessary. He offered a constitutional amendment to move the congressional calendar from January to January, as it currently exists today. And this reduced the time constraint that allowed filibusters to thrive. The Senate did not, and I should say that was ratified in 1933 and took effect in 1934. The Senate did not take up reform, but Dawes's campaign may have had some effect. The Senate voted on 7 cloture motions during the 69th Congress, more than would be filed in the next 15 years combined. The Senate invoked cloture 3 times. That had only happened once before and would not happen again until 1961. On January 18th, 1926, when Senator James Heflin of Alabama filed cloture on a measure being held up by William Borah of Idaho, Borah said, quote, I trust the senator from Alabama observes the very broad smile mantling the face of the vice president, which apparently got a round of laughter according to the congressional record. If you are surprised to hear that a senator from Alabama filed cloture, you are not alone. Senator Coleman Blease of South Carolina took to the floor to say, quote, I do not for the life of me see how any man south of the Potomac River could stand upon the floor of this chamber to invoke that rule. I believed that my distinguished friend from Alabama was merely jesting when he threw out that suggestion. With an adjournment date agreed upon with the House for July 3rd of 1926, a host of other measures, including spending bills, became tied up in filibusters. As bills were piling up, Senator Henry Ashurst of Arizona took the time to point out to his colleagues that Dawes's campaign for reform had been, quote, abundantly vindicated. Dawes kept up his crusade off the floor in 1926, but at the end of the 69th Congress, he took an even more active role in trying to break through Senate logjams. In February of 1927, 2 measures faced fierce opposition in the Senate. One was a farm bill sponsored by Republican Senator Charles McNary, which would have propped up crop prices. The other was a bill to extend the charters of Federal Reserve banks, and that bill faced a filibuster by Robert La Follette Jr., son of the late famed progressive. Dawes took it upon himself to work out a deal to break the logjam. The vice president called both groups to a meeting in his office. One of the participants, Pennsylvania's George Wharton Pepper, commented that, quote, by sheer force of his personality, Dawes forced an agreement that that both measures should be voted upon. The Senate invoked cloture on the bank bill and approved final passage, followed by passage of the farm bill. Unfortunately, President Coolidge was not in on this plan of his and vetoed the farm bill and further strained the relationship between the two. Despite these efforts, the 69th Congress closed on March 4th, 1927 in chaos with multiple bills, including important appropriations, blocked by various senators. As the clock ticked toward noon, with Pat Harrison of Mississippi holding the floor, a Republican senator rose and asked, quote, "Does the chair recognize that the other side is monopolizing all the time that remains before final adjournment?" Dawes' reply, quote, "The chair recognizes in general that in some way the public interests are being sacrificed. The expedition of public business is much to be desired, but the chair is powerless to take any action in the matter except to recognize a senator who rises first and says, 'Mr. President.'" After testy exchanges and recriminations all around, Dawes rapped his gavel for the final adjournment and said to the assembled senators, quote, "The chair regards the results of the present legislative session as primarily due to the defective rules of the Senate, under which a minority can prevent a majority from exercising their constitutional right of bringing a measure to a vote. The chair recommends to the Senate the remarks upon the Senate rules which he made on the first day of this first session of this Congress." After 2 more years in the presiding officer's chair, Dawes limped to the finish line with his campaign with no action taken on changing the cloture rule. He watched each session of Congress end in similar disarray. As he prepared to take his final leave of the Senate and see his replacement sworn in, Republican leader Charles Curtis, one of the Senate's own, he reiterated his disapproval of the Senate's fundamental defect, the filibuster. "I take nothing back," he said. For their part, the senators lauded Dawes with praise for his performance in the chamber and in the presiding officer's chair and paid him what's a rather sincere tribute. In his journal published years later, Dawes recounted how a senator told him, quote, "The senators think much of you now, but the Senate got very tired of you at the beginning of your service." Dawes replied, quote, "I should hate to think that the Senate was as tired of me at the beginning of my service as I am at the end of it." Charles Dawes continued his career in public service until his death in 1951. Dawes was a consummate doer with little patience for politics. The vice presidency may not have been the best fit for him in retrospect. It was perhaps the height of hubris for Dawes from the position that had long been stripped of substantive power in the chamber to believe that he could persuade the Senate to change its rules. Dawes took his best shot with the limited influence he had, but the filibuster long outlived him. It would be left to the senators themselves to grapple with the filibuster in the years and decades ahead. If anything, the filibuster became more entrenched in the Senate in the years following, frequently wielded by Southern Democrats against civil rights measures. It was not until 1964 that a supermajority of senators voted to break a filibuster on a Civil Rights Act. We are once again in a moment in the 21st century when the broader public is engaged in a debate about the filibuster and what it means for the character of the Senate. While some point to the filibuster as a deep-seated tradition of the Senate, history also tells us that the tactics and rules surrounding it have changed over time, and that the rule has been subject to constant debate. Senators have periodically changed the rules governing the filibuster, which measures it could be applied to, how many votes are required to invoke cloture, how much debate could take place after cloture was granted. Today, the filibuster exists, but without the dramatic marathon speeches on the Senate floor that were so famous in the early 20th century. Instead, even the threat of a filibuster today can succeed in pushing a measure off the legislative agenda. And despite criticism, it endures. Because just as in Dawes' time, a majority of senators find it useful and see it as an essential to what makes the Senate the Senate. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dan. That was so interesting. And I consider myself something of an expert on Dawes, and I learned some things. So I'm guessing everybody on the webinar learned a lot of things as well. So I'm just going to take the role of reading some of the questions, kind of in no particular order. Did Dawes have, I know he had, who were his allies on on this campaign. So yeah, he must have had some people helping him out, but
he did not have very many allies. So William Butler of Massachusetts was someone who was able to speak up and say that he was in favor of this. As I mentioned, Henry Ashurst of Arizona, who's a longtime Republican, also spoke up in favor of this. But Dawes even mentioned in his journal later on that he was disappointed to find that senators who would in private sound like they were on his side, when they came back to the chamber, or when they were very reticent to get out in front of other members in order to support it. So it was really kind of a lonely battle for Dawes for those couple of years.
well, it sounds like the more things change, perhaps the more they stay the same on that front.
And I would add too, one of the things that's interesting about his timing is in 1917, you get the first cloture rule. The year after that, you already get some movement, and surprisingly by a Southern Democrat, to lower the cloture threshold to a simple majority on revenue and appropriations bills. Because even though they want to keep civil rights to the side, they're kind of getting frustrated with the difficulty of getting these kind of bread and butter things passed. And that did get some debate, but it failed. And so Dawes was coming to this just after a campaign had kind of already been waged and lost on changing the cloture rule so soon after it had been adopted in the first place.
So in your opinion, obviously this isn't a historical question, is there any chance that in our lifetimes are we going to see the end of the filibuster?
I can unfortunately only speak about the past and not very good about speaking about the future. I think but what I can say, and I think is on fair, solid footing, is current members of the Senate still find something important in the rule. So whether commentators outside of the Senate get frustrated with that and disagree, I think senators, when they come here, they find something about the powers that are afforded to single senators that gives them an ability to play an important role in the Senate. Whereas you'll hear oftentimes on the House side that if you're not in leadership there, you're not as involved in the legislative process. So I would say that senators, as far as it stands now, a majority of senators think that this is a useful tool to have, and so that's why it's still around.
So, well, I mean, I guess I understand what you're saying about why it's still around, obviously, but it's not part of the Constitution, right? And so
Right.
That's what I think people struggle with. Why is it so difficult? Why does it persist? Why is it so difficult to alter? I think us lay people think of that as the things that are most difficult are the constitutional.
Right. I think what's interesting about the debate, and you'll see this in a lot of recent discussion about it, there's this big debate over whether the filibuster was there at the beginning. And Charles Dawes actually, part of his speech that day in the inaugural address was to say something to the effect of, I don't think members of the first Congress would have stood for this. If you told them that this is how the Senate works, I think they wouldn't have agreed with that. And it's true that the filibuster as it comes to exist later was not there in the beginning. But one thing that I think gets lost in that discussion is that there are things about the way that the framers understood the Senate, with filibuster or no, that are true, which is that the Senate was supposed to be kind of slow. It was supposed to be deliberative. It was a place where there was this idea where this smaller body would be a check on the democratic passions from the House of Representatives. And so I think all those things are true going back to the beginning, even if the mechanism of the filibuster was not the method through which that was done, I think.
And you talked a little bit about this. Maybe you could expand on the origins in certainly not, I guess in racism, not in civil rights, because civil rights obviously didn't exist in the, so you touched on it, but how deep do you think that, how accurate a statement would it be to say the filibuster is all about,
I think it's important to say that that is a very important component, but it's not the only component. And that's why I hope this part of this talk opens people up to the other ways and other members who use the filibuster. And this is even true going into the 1950s. There are other issues that come up that become subject to the filibuster. I think, the ones that are kind of the most important, the ones that we hear about the most and were really centrally important to American history did involve civil rights. And that really begins with one of the first real modern filibusters in 1890, when Senate Democrats organized as a group to keep a federal elections bill, what the South called the Force Bill, from being passed. And from there on, you get these, in 1922, you get filibusters of an anti-lynching law. In 1937-38, another anti-lynching law gets held up, and then other measures into the 1940s. The other thing I think is important to keep in mind with that is, the determined Southern minority powers that were able to keep, one of the ways that they were able to keep civil rights off the agenda is that the side that was in favor of civil rights wasn't always willing to go as far as it would take to get it passed. And that's kind of also what I hope comes through in this talk. There's a lot of calculation always going on when the filibuster was in play. What legislation do you want to get passed? How are you going to get it passed? What do you have to give up to get your legislation passed? And in many ways, civil rights legislation was always expendable in the Senate until the 1950s and 60s, unfortunately.
Okay, I'm going to try to bring some of these questions together. We've had a flood of questions, but on that, how interested are U.S. senators today in your office? Now, forget about filibuster for 4 seconds, because we'll be coming back to the questions. But how many senators know you guys exist, are happy to come see you, help out? I don't know, like what's the perception of who you're, I know you're serving me, but who you're,
But yeah, so we're in, we are both public facing and inward facing. So it makes us an interesting office. We do what we can internally. I would say it's not a flood from senators, but we do get staff who come to us and they do want to know things that are either relative to, sometimes it's just things that they're curious about, but it can be relative to legislation that they're working on. It could be just wanting to understand how we've gotten, in the last year, we've gotten plenty of senators' offices coming and asking about these questions related to the history of the filibuster. We also work, so I would say, we get a good amount of interest. It's maybe not like a flood of it. Sometimes senators will certainly go out and rely on their own expertise or sources to make comments. And sometimes I'll be like, oh, they might have called us, or they might have gotten that a little bit, that kind of thing. But for the most part, we do get some really good questions, and we're happy to be that kind of a resource here.
That's really interesting. And I'm glad to hear that you are well used. How does House Dawes seen today? I think working here at the Dawes House,
you might get this one better than me.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what I say, which is when I start introducing the House and I start introducing Dawes, I say things like, he was vice president, and then you have to say of the United States, so he might be a little forgotten. I don't know if that's the case of vice presidents in general. I don't know if maybe we can drum up a little interest in him now with all a filibuster. So I don't know if you have a perspective on that.
Yeah, I think he probably falls under that important person who gets largely forgotten, which is honestly kind of it's kind of a thing around here in the Senate. There are very important senators who are not household names, and we do our best to try and draw attention to them. In Dawes's case, it's funny, I was reading in his journal, and he talked about when he left that he was leaving public life, but he did anything but that.
Yeah.
He played, he became head of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation under the Herbert Hoover administration, which was, one of the first kind of efforts to deal with the Great Depression prior to the New Deal of Roosevelt. just doing that job alone, I think, makes him, important going forward. But he was a public servant in a lot of other ways going forward. And so, yeah, like, I think if people did learn more about him, I think they'd be really interested to hear the way he tried to be an independent voice within the Senate while he was here. His notion that he was something apart, which is both what makes the vice presidency interesting in the Senate, but from the very beginning, when I can't remember which founder said it, but when they were debating the Constitution and they said the vice president will be the president of the Senate, they said, well, you might as well just have the president come down and sit here in the chamber with us. Like, right, there was this sense that this was somewhat of an encroachment on the legislative branch. But so when he was there, I think he used used his position in a way that maybe not all vice presidents did, and I think that's a really, I think, interesting legacy to keep in mind.
And is this filibuster only in the Senate or the House as well?
The filibuster, in terms of thinking about like long speeches and that kind of thing, is very much a Senate story. But late 19th century, if you kind of think of filibuster broadly as any kind of obstructive tactics in debate, was actually very much a House of Representatives thing. It was just used different. There were different tactics to slow things down. And what you get then in the late night, around the same time that the filibuster is becoming really important in the Senate, the House is actually adopting rules that make it harder to obstruct because there is so much obstruction. Speaker Thomas Brackett Reed in the 1890-91 adopts a series of rules that are called the Reed Rules. And essentially he strong arms the House. And my colleagues on the House side will speak to this much better than I will. But the short version is he forces through rules changes that make it harder and harder for minorities in the House side to block legislation. And so when you get into the 20th century, it becomes very much more of a Senate phenomenon at that point.
Okay, sorry, I'm not looking at my phone. These are where your questions are. This is, somebody says, I've heard that Madison and other framers of the Constitution did not want a filibuster and that the Articles of the Confederation had a filibuster which prevented it from acting. Do you know anything about this?
I don't know a lot about how the Continental Congress functioned, probably not as much as I should know. But the government under the Articles of Confederation it just worked very differently to the extent that there was only one vote for each state, and the threshold for getting things passed was difficult to reach anyway. I think when people debate the filibuster, and dealing with Madison, what they're usually doing is finding his discussion about the rule, like majority rule. I find, if you parse the founders, you can find support for almost anything that you want to find. For as much as they were worried about, quote unquote, tyranny of the majority, there's also plenty of discussion where they were concerned about what they called factional majorities that could come together and prevent and overcome the public good as they understood it. So they were concerned about, like, they were in favor of majorities ruling in the long run, but as I did say, they also did understand the Senate as a slower cooling off period in the legislative process, even if they didn't specifically say something to the effect of, we believe in something called the filibuster that should work this way, because the way that it works today, and even if you had explained it to them, I don't know if they would have, they understood, like I said, with the William Maclay Journal, they understood the idea that you can kill time by talking a lot. I don't know if they would have understood what Dawes was looking at when there is this just chaos at the end of every session where they unanimously pass 150 bills with no discussion, and important bills died at the end because they couldn't break through that, the obstruction of one or a few members.
Do you have a sense of what the composition of the Senate was when Dawes was presiding, and did he ever have occasion to cast tie-breaking votes?
He only had very few chances to cast tie-breaking votes, but the most important tie-breaking vote was the one he did not cast.
Oh, yeah.
And I mentioned that he, for people who don't know this story, I did mention that he was on the outs with Coolidge. And so on March 5th, he makes this stirring speech that throws everybody off in the Senate. Coolidge has the Senate come back into special session to confirm his Attorney General nominee, Charles Warren. And so a few days later, this is going to come up. Dawes believes that there's going to be a handful of speakers on the floor of the Senate, and he has plenty of time before he has to come back. So I did say they sat in the chair day in and day out. They didn't sit there all the time. They can still come and go sometimes. In this case, he decided to go to a hotel and take a nap, sure that 4 senators who spoke would take plenty of time. Unbeknownst to him, 3 of the 4 senators decided that they didn't want to have anything to say anymore, and the nomination went to a vote, and it was a tie vote. And Charles Dawes was asleep in his hotel room. Yeah. And they roused him up, and he got his way back to the chamber. And before he could cast a tie vote, one of the Republicans who had voted, or I'm sorry, one of the Democrats who had voted for the nominee actually changed their vote to against. So his tie vote didn't matter anymore, and the nomination was defeated.
And I believe that that's famously the last straw in this strained Coolidge-Dawes relationship, right?
Yeah, it did not help, and that was like a week into the administration.
Oh, that's a shame. I think I'm asking this right. Could the Supreme Court make a ruling on filibuster, or is that, or whether it's constitutionality, or is that not within their purview? Do you know?
I'm going to leave that one to the constitutional lawyers out there.
Okay. Well, if anybody knows, put it in our chat. And my colleague Jenny, who's fast and furious sending these to me, she's so great, she'll answer that. To what extent was anti-racism or racism a factor in Dawes's work, do you think, or was it a byproduct or not a consideration?
Having not done, from what I've read, it didn't really come up. In fact, one thing that I did mention, right, Dawes did not come to this stance on the filibuster because he was interested in civil rights. He actually went out of his way to tell Southerners, don't worry about it. We can adopt a rule that won't threaten federal government action to enforce civil rights. Mm-hmm. Because this was constantly in front of the government in the 19-teens and 1920s. He said he was really more concerned about what he thought of as like good government legislation and that kind of thing. So that even at the time, there was a Republican governing agenda that was being stifled and held up. And that was his, I think, most important goal. I don't think, unfortunately, that he thought very much about the way that the filibuster dealt with civil rights in his era.
Mm-hmm. I promise to wrap it up soon, but so many people are interested. You spoke about using the filibuster to prevent legislation. When Dawes was vice president, was there debate on using the filibuster to prevent nominations, such as cabinet positions or Supreme Court justices?
Not in the same way that came later. For the most part, so like the Charles Warren Attorney General nominee is a good example. There wasn't a filibuster against that nominee. There was just there weren't enough in favor, and it was brought to a vote. Most of the time, there was the idea at the time was to generally, especially on important high-level executive branch nomination, that you would give the president certain deference in confirming them. That didn't mean all the time, because during this time is when you do start to get scrutiny of Supreme Court nominations, where they're being brought in to testify first in private, later on in public. the kind of the regular use of the filibuster, I think the other most interesting period is in the late 1960s, when the nomination of, blanking on the name of the Supreme Court nominee who was filibustered, but there was a cloture vote to end debate to move forward that nomination, and it lost. And later on, the nominations becomes a really important turf in the fight over the filibuster over the last 20 years. And I don't know how much everybody is familiar with what took place over the last decade, in which for nominees now, the ability, you can now end debate on nominees with a simple majority. So the filibuster is really just in place now for legislation, not for nominees, because of the back and forth fight over that, beginning in around 2003 or so. So yeah.
And would you say liberals or conservatives today profit most from ending the filibuster? But it appears that both sides have effectively used the filibuster, and maybe it's not a liberal conservative kind of discussion.
It's mostly been a majority minority, not because senators who think with a long time horizon traditionally have thought, if we get rid of this tool, then we will not be able to use it when we are back in the minority again. And so that, I think, that has been somewhat of a tempering force when it came to proposals to end the filibuster. And I should point out, I didn't get to talk about this much, but trying to change the cloture threshold to a simple majority was like a regular proposal and debate in the 1960s. At the start of every Congress, there was an attempt to use some kind of parliamentary maneuvering to change the Senate rules to lower the threshold to a simple majority. And until 1975, there was not a majority in favor of doing so. And then in 1975, we get changes to the rule. And that's the most interesting. There's, this rule changes over time, right? There's tradition, but then there's the general ebb and flow of how these things are used and the different ways that they are interpreted by members at any given time. And so the filibuster is not just one thing, it's kind of been many things over the course of the Senate's history. So I think the best part about seeing Dawes is when you read Dawes's discussions and the responses to him, they sound really familiar. Yeah. And that's right. You could just be reading this. His speech could be the same thing today for someone who's looking to change the filibuster rule. And the support for it could be almost the same way that it's spoken of today as well. So this debate is enduring and somewhat repetitive.
Yeah, right. Every couple seasons it comes back. Or I do want to point out, honestly, we've had so many questions. People are just absolutely fascinated. So I'm delighted that people are so engaged. We had a conversation before all the audience joined us, and we were talking right about how great it would be, excuse me, to be together in person. But it's also, I'm delighted that so many people are engaging with us, and with the tools that we have.
Speaking of for folks who aren't going to be able to get their question heard tonight, we have an email inbox that we monitor to try and help folks out with questions. The email address is, and I should have written this to show, it's historian at sec.senate.gov. Historian at sec.senate.gov. If you go to senate.gov, you'll see our content on the web that's there to educate and share some of these stories. You'll find a really good rundown of Charles Dawes' career as vice president there. And you'll see that email address, and you could please feel free to email questions if you're burning to have them answered.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Maybe somebody will put it in the chat. Were there other famous clashes between Dawes and Coolidge that you're aware of? I know that's the famous one, and then there is a simmering kind of dislike, I guess, or just...
Yeah, Well, I thought that the most interesting thing somebody pointed out was when Calvin Coolidge wrote a memoir, he didn't bother mentioning Charles Dawes by name.
I don't know if you're familiar with Amity Schleye's book about Coolidge, and she spoke here back when we could have people, and hopefully, we will again. And we had she also pointed out, it must have been difficult to write said memoir and leave out, like it would be so difficult and conscious,
Yeah.
I don't take sides, but we're kind of all, many of us here are sort of Dawesophiles, so.
Yeah, it's good. You're in the tank form. It's okay.
Do you know, and you might not do state senates have the same, is filibuster a thing within, at the state level,
I unfortunately don't know a lot
don't
about
know
how
either.
state senate function, but one thing that I will say is, right, attempts to prevent things from getting passed is universal. And so for folks who have been following, in Texas where the Democrats fled the state, that would be considered some kind of maybe we wouldn't call it filibuster, but clearly it's an obstructive maneuver to try and prevent a majority from passing something. And apparently that happens in Texas every 10 years or so, because we have an essay on our website that starts by talking about lawmakers in Texas fleeing the state. And I had to point out to somebody that wasn't referring to the current time that Texas lawmakers were fleeing the state. It was another time that happened in the past. So in that sense, I think, and people who study Congress from like a political science perspective would be able to speak maybe on this better when it comes to just speaking holistically about legislative bodies. But I think obstructive and creative techniques for trying to slow down the majority is fairly probably common.
I think that is a really interesting way to look at it. Filibuster is sort of a word, right? And it means something specific. And you even told us it's basis, but this idea of obstruction, that's what it's a specific type of obstruction. And I think we all have a greater sense of what that might mean. I know when I think of it broadly in that way. Right. Well, I think I have tried to put together some questions, and I think we've answered most of the questions. I do want to thank you for sharing your contact info, or in terms of how people can get questions answered. And I also want to let our audience know that we will be sharing a recording. So if you registered, which you did because you're on the call, we'll also share a recording. So if you think, what did he say about that? Or, oh, I really want to hear that part again, that will be available to you. It'll be emailed to you in the next couple of days.
Download it, listen to it in your car on the way to work.
To amaze your friends and family with facts, right? That things you never knew you didn't know. And that's how I feel. I had there are lots of things I didn't know. So that is great.
That's this job in a nutshell. Knowing that there are things you don't know, and that we're constantly learning new things and revisiting old stories and thinking of new questions to ask. And so that's kind of the best part of this job, is that we have the ability to do that. So.
It does sound like a terrific job, and I am so grateful to you for sharing your time. I'm very grateful to my colleague Jenny Thompson, who put this together, and to our partners at Alliance Bernstein, Andy Jacobs and his awesome team in Chicago. Dan, this has been a real pleasure. Thank you so much, and I do hope, it sounds like there's so much material here, so I hope that we can all see a future, that we can be together, and that you would consider coming back and seeing us in person, and sharing more of these stories and history. So thank you so much.
That would be great. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.